TV7 Israel News is made possible thanks to your generous donations.
Shalom, good evening. This is TV7 Israel News broadcast to you from Jerusalem. And in today's top stories, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu asserts that Israel will not plunge into civil war. While Israel and the United States prioritize efforts to normalize Jerusalem's relations with Riyadh, Saudi Arabia remains resolute about the need for Israel to first advance peace with the Palestinians. The European Union does not intend to promote peace between Israel and countries in the Gulf, as it intends to focus on developing its own strategic partnership between the EU and the GCC. Israel will not plunge into civil war despite rhetoric and voiced alarm by marginal groups of extremists who seek to so-called sink the ship if the captain does not chart course in accordance with their standards. For more than 5 months, Israelis flooded the streets of various cities to voice their opposition to the incumbent coalition's intention to reform the judiciary. However, these protests have relatively dwindled in recent weeks, since the government acquiesced to President Isaac Herzog's request to delay legislation related to the reform for the purpose of engaging in dialogue with the opposition, with the core aim of plausibly reaching broad national consensus on key issues of contention. And while weekly demonstrations persisted, drawing several tens of thousands of Israelis who are exclusively identified with progressive left, a new phenomenon emerged in which small groups of Israeli activists essentially stalk members of the coalition everywhere they go to unrelentingly disrupt their public functions by crying out shame over intentions to reform the judiciary. Unfortunately, on several occasions, these disruptive actions have led to physical altercations between bodyguards of the public servants and activists who know no bounds. Meanwhile, at a ceremony commemorating the Altalena affair, which is regarded as a moment in history which Israel almost plunged into civil war, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seized the opportunity to assert that the phenomenon of intimidation and threats vis-à-vis public officials was and remains unacceptable.
The internal debate in Israeli society on the issue of judicial reform has led certain extremist elements to threaten to topple the state into anarchy. Let it be clear, it is permitted to demonstrate in the state of Israel. It is permitted to protest. Indeed, most demonstrators are expressing their position in ways that are acceptable in democracies. However, in other instances, red lines and norms have been rudely trampled underfoot in violations of the law, disturbances, attacking public officials, and in threatening the family members of public officials.
While urging leaders of the opposition to rein in their unruly activists, Netanyahu went on to assert that as the Prime Minister of Israel, he will always remember the lessons of the Altalena affair, which constituted a limited battle between the newly established IDF and the revisionist Irgun militia in June of 1948, since the latter intended to refuse turning over the Altalena cargo vessel's shipment of weaponry that was transferred to them by the French government of the then President Vincent Jules Arion. And while the IDF ultimately sunk the Irgun-controlled Altalena vessel, killing 16 and capturing another 200 of the Irgun's militiamen, Irgun leader Menachem Begin ordered his men to stand down for the recorded purpose of averting civil war.
As Prime Minister of the State of the Jewish people, I always remember the lessons of the Altalena. Therefore, I have emphasized time and again that, without giving in on just positions, I am ready for dialogue in order to exhaust the chances for reaching agreements. I added, and I add today once more, there can be no civil war. I have added another message aimed at those in the region: do not count on a civil war.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held a phone conversation with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken last night, during which the two were set to discuss both challenges and opportunities in the region. While an elaborate discussion was held on the threat emanating from the Islamic Republic of Iran, the core focus of this conversation related to prospects of further integrating the State of Israel into the Middle East by normalizing relations with the countries of the region, including the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where the top American diplomat is currently engaged in efforts to foster more constructive dialogue with the monarchy, as well as with its close regional partners and allies of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Speaking alongside his counterpart in the Saudi capital, Secretary Blinken highlighted Washington's priority of Jerusalem and Riyadh normalizing relations.
We fully support Israel's integration into the Middle East, and from day one, we have been working both to deepen some of the existing agreements and also expand them to other countries. That includes Saudi Arabia. I think this would be a very important step forward, and it would certainly be a priority and is a priority for us. Integration is good for the region, for all concerned, and we will continue to pursue it. We discussed it here, and we will continue to work at it and to advance it in the days, weeks, and months ahead.
We believe that normalization is in the interest of the region, that it would bring significant benefits to all, but without finding a pathway to peace for the Palestinian people, without addressing that challenge, any normalization will have limited benefits. And therefore, I think we should continue to focus on finding a pathway towards a two-state solution, on finding a pathway towards giving the Palestinians dignity and justice, and I think the US has a similar view that it's important to continue on those efforts.
While Iran, via Chinese mediation, managed to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, in a move largely viewed as causality to US inaction in the face of Tehran's blind behavior, the top diplomats of the United States and members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, and Qatar, held a lengthy discussion over Iran's destabilizing influence in the region.
The United States and Saudi Arabia, together with the GCC, are also focused on Iran's destabilizing influence in the region, including its support for terrorism and violent militia groups, the seizure of tankers transiting international waters, and nuclear escalation. The United States continues to believe that diplomacy, backed by economic pressure, by deterrence, and by strong defense cooperation, is the best way to counter these dangerous actions. We support efforts by Saudi Arabia to de-escalate tension and stabilize relations.
Making a sharp shift to Brussels, where the European Union announced, following the appointment of former Italian Foreign Minister Luigi Di Maio as EU Special Representative for the Gulf, that its emissary has taken office and is actively working to further develop a stronger, comprehensive, and more strategic EU partnership with the countries in the Gulf region.
Indeed, I can confirm that the new EU Special Representative for the Gulf, Luigi Di Maio, took up office yesterday. Even physically, he started to work on the agenda with which he was tasked. You know that part of his mandate is linked to the EU strategy for the Gulf. That means engaging with the partners both within the European Union and in the Gulf in order to bring our relationship to new level, to deepen our strategic cooperation, and to do everything in order to support whatever the European Union, the High Representative, and our member states are doing in order to really reinforce the notion of strategic partnership between the European Union and the Gulf states, because there are many challenges we need to tackle jointly, and it's very good that the EUSR started his activities to be able to contribute in these efforts.
Asked whether the European Union would join the US in promoting Israel's normalization with additional Gulf states, Stano highlighted that while supportive of peace, Jerusalem's normalization in the region is not a matter which the EU intends to promote.
The mandate of the EU Special Representative for the Gulf is linked to EU policies. The Abraham Accords are bilateral decisions and bilateral issues between the individual countries in the region. So this is not something for the EU to advance, to promote. Of course, we are supporting any efforts leading to normalization of relations between the Arab countries and Israel. But in the end, these are decisions which are sovereign decisions of the nations involved.
It is important to know that while the EU is ratcheting up its efforts to bolster its relations with the countries in the Gulf, earlier this week on Tuesday, Belgian police raided the office of yet another EU lawmaker who is suspected of a corruption scandal related to the so-called Qatargate, in which Doha allegedly bribed members of the European Parliament, lobbies, and NGOs, among others, to further its own interests throughout the European continent and beyond. Thank you for watching TV7 Israel News. If you're blessed by our productions, which are exclusively funded by viewers just like yourself, please consider making a financial contribution that in turn will enable us to sustain our ongoing operations. Additionally, I would like to encourage you to pray for our persecuted brothers and sisters worldwide and for the peace of Jerusalem and salvation of Israel. I'm Jonathan Essen wishing you a Shabbat Shalom u'Mevorach, and God willing, we'll see you again on Monday at the same time.